As I stepped into my home, a wave of excitement washed over me, the familiar scent of fresh linen and the faint aroma of coffee lingering in the air. My recent business trip had been both exhausting and exhilarating, filled with meetings and networking that ignited my professional ambitions. I could hardly wait to share the stories of my travels with Henry, to see the sparkle in his eyes as I recounted the moments that had inspired me. I imagined the two of us sitting on the couch, the warmth of our connection enveloping us like a cozy blanket on a chilly evening. With each step I took through the hallway, a sense of warmth blossomed in my chest. The walls of our home, adorned with photographs of our happiest moments, whispered memories of laughter and love. I could almost hear Henry's voice echoing through the rooms, teasing me about my propensity to bring back souvenirs from every trip, no matter how trivial. I had picked up a small trinket this time, a tiny replica of the Eiffel Tower, a symbol of my ambition to one day visit Paris with him. I envisioned his smile as I handed it to him, the way he would tease me about my obsession with collecting mementos. But as I moved deeper into the house, a strange silence fell around me, wrapping itself around my heart like a cold, clammy hand. I paused in the living room, my senses sharpening as I took in the unusual stillness. The television was off, there were no sounds of Henry bustling about, no soft music playing in the background. My heart began to race, an unsettling feeling creeping up my spine. I brushed it aside, forcing myself to remain optimistic. Perhaps he was just caught up in a moment of relaxation, enjoying a rare day off from work. I made my way to the kitchen, expecting to find the comforting sight of Henry preparing a meal or at least a half-eaten snack left on the counter. But the kitchen was pristine, untouched. The silence grew heavier, pressing down on me, causing me to feel a strange mix of anxiety and anticipation. I called out his name softly, the sound echoing back to me, unanswered. The absence of his voice felt like a punch to my gut, and I swallowed hard, trying to convince myself that he must have stepped out for a moment, perhaps to run an errand. With a determined breath, I continued toward our bedroom, my heart pounding louder with each step. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the familiar scent of our shared space filling my nostrils. I felt a rush of warmth at the sight of our bed, the sheets perfectly made, a small comfort in the unsettling atmosphere. But as I turned my gaze toward the bed, my heart dropped, and the world around me faded into a blur. There, entwined together in an intimate embrace, lay Henry and Clara, our neighbor. Time seemed to freeze as disbelief coursed through me, my mind racing to process the shocking scene before me. The room spun as my heart shattered into a million pieces, each fragment cutting deeper than the last. The warmth I had felt moments before evaporated, leaving behind a cold void that settled in the pit of my stomach. I stood frozen at the threshold, grappling with the reality of what I was witnessing. The laughter and love I had envisioned sharing with Henry moments ago were replaced by the stark betrayal that hung in the air. The intimacy between them felt like a cruel joke, a gut-wrenching revelation that turned my entire world upside down. My mind churned with questions, anger, and an insatiable desire for answers. How could he? How could she? For a moment, I felt as if I were outside my body, watching the scene unfold with a detached curiosity. The chaotic emotions surged within me, a tempest of rage and heartbreak battling for supremacy. As the gravity of my situation sank in, I realized that this was not just a moment of betrayal, it was the beginning of a reckoning. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: I could no longer remain a passive observer in my own life. In the days following the discovery, I felt like a marionette with its strings cut, left to flounder aimlessly in a world that no longer felt familiar. The ache in my chest was a constant companion, a reminder of the betrayal that had shattered my reality. Henry's hollow apologies echoed in my mind, each word resonating with a weight that only deepened my resentment. He spoke of regret and love, but all I could see was the image of him entwined with Clara, the very woman who had stood at our doorstep, sharing friendly smiles and casual conversations. I oscillated between anger and sorrow, unable to settle into either emotion. Some days, I could barely look at him without feeling a surge of fury coursing through my veins. Other days, I found myself torn by memories of the man I thought I knew, the man who had held my hand during difficult times, who had promised to be my partner through thick and thin. But those memories felt tainted now, overshadowed by what I had witnessed. The house felt like a cage, every corner a reminder of the life we had built together, now irrevocably fractured. When I confronted Henry, his eyes were filled with an all-too-familiar blend of guilt and remorse. He sat on the edge of the bed, his shoulders slumped, as he offered me apologies that felt as empty as the space between us. I could see the struggle in his face, the desire to explain, to somehow make things right. But how could he? The betrayal had carved a chasm between us, and no amount of words could bridge that divide. Each time he reached out, I recoiled, as if his touch burned. It was one evening, after another round of his insincere reassurances, that I decided to take a walk. The cool night air was refreshing against my skin, but it did little to ease the turmoil within. I wandered through the neighborhood, each step punctuated by the sound of my heartbeat, a steady reminder of my existence. The streetlights cast a soft glow on the pavement, illuminating the paths I had walked countless times before. Yet now, everything felt different, each familiar corner tinged with a bittersweet nostalgia. Days passed in a blur. I found myself at the grocery store one afternoon, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, as I pushed my cart through the aisles. I was lost in my thoughts, contemplating the list of items I needed while simultaneously wrestling with the chaos in my heart. That's when I saw her, Clara. She stood in the produce section, casually selecting apples, her demeanor so nonchalant as if nothing had changed. My heart raced at the sight of her, rage bubbling beneath the surface. I felt a primal urge to confront her, to unleash the tempest of emotions that had become my constant companion. But I held my tongue, the weight of my pain anchoring me in place. Instead, I forced myself to breathe, to navigate around her as if she were simply another shopper. The encounter left my heart pounding, my mind racing with unspoken words. The drive home was a blur, my thoughts spiraling as I replayed the moment in my mind. How could she act so casually after what had transpired? I felt a simmering anger, a desire for vengeance that I had never known before. I wanted to confront her, to scream and shout, to make her feel the pain that I felt. But deep down, I recognized that my true battle lay not with her, but with myself. Back in the sanctuary of my home, I sought solace in my journal. The soft rustle of the pages felt like a balm against my wounded soul as I poured my thoughts onto the paper. Each word was cathartic, a release of the emotions that had been pent up within me. I wrote about my feelings of betrayal, the deep hurt that had taken root in my heart, and the confusion that clouded my sense of self. As the ink flowed, I began to untangle the knots of my identity that had formed around my marriage, my role as a wife, and the person I had become in the shadow of Henry's infidelity. With each entry, I unearthed fragments of strength buried beneath the hurt, remnants of the woman I had once been before love had become synonymous with pain. I realized that while I had been betrayed, I was still here, still breathing, still capable of reclaiming my narrative. The journey ahead would not be easy, but in those quiet moments of reflection, I began to see the glimmer of resilience within me. It was a small flame, but it was enough to light the way forward. The weight of betrayal hung in the air like a thick mist, and I knew I had to do something. The shock of discovering Henry and Clara together had ignited a fire within me, a desire not just for revenge, but for control over my own narrative. I couldn't allow myself to be a passive victim in this chaotic drama that had unfolded. I needed to know the full extent of their entanglement, to gather evidence that would solidify my understanding of the betrayal and empower me to confront them both. With that resolve, I began my investigation. Each day after work, I would return home, heart racing, not knowing what I might uncover. I rummaged through Henry's belongings, meticulously searching for anything that might reveal their secret, emails, texts, or even forgotten notes. I felt like a detective in a dark thriller, each clue leading me deeper into a labyrinth of deceit. It was unsettling, yet invigorating. This was my chance to reclaim my narrative. The first breakthrough came when I discovered Henry's phone left unattended on the kitchen counter one evening. My heart raced as I picked it up, the screen illuminating with messages that revealed intimate exchanges between him and Clara. The words leapt off the screen, each one a dagger to my heart. I felt a surge of anger mixed with determination. I quickly took screenshots, knowing that this evidence would be crucial in the confrontation I was preparing for. I had to hold on to this power, to remind myself that I was not powerless in this situation. As the days passed, I found myself collecting more pieces of the puzzle. Photos of them together at a local cafe, messages that hinted at late-night rendezvous, and even a string of emojis that felt like a punchline to a cruel joke. Each new discovery brought forth a mix of emotions, hurt, rage, and an undeniable sense of empowerment. I was no longer that naive woman who believed in the sanctity of her marriage. I was a woman scorned, ready to reclaim her story. With every piece of evidence I compiled, I felt the weight of my pain transform into something fierce. I was no longer just Mary, the devoted wife. I was Mary, the woman who would confront the betrayal head-on. This realization fueled my resolve. I began to envision the confrontation, how I would stand before them unyielding and strong. I could almost hear the cracks of their denial, the excuses they would stutter out, but I would be prepared. I had the truth on my side. The night of the confrontation approached, and I found myself sitting across from Henry at the dining table. I masked my turmoil with a facade of normalcy. We shared a meal that felt like a ritual of pretense, each bite heavy with unspoken words. I could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface, a volatile energy that buzzed in the air like static electricity. I watched him as he casually spoke about his day, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing within me. I was acutely aware of my own heart pounding, a reminder that I was alive, that I was still capable of feeling despite the betrayal. I glanced at him, taking note of the way he absent-mindedly brushed crumbs from his shirt, the way his laugh felt hollow. I wanted to scream, to unleash every ounce of pain and confusion I had bottled up since that day. But I held back, carefully crafting my thoughts, preparing for the moment when I would finally lay it all bare. The room felt small, suffocating, as I steeled myself for the truth that would shatter our fragile peace. Inside, I was a tempest, swirling with emotions that threatened to break free at any moment. My mind raced with the evidence I had collected, the plan I had meticulously laid out. I was not just preparing to confront Henry, I was also ready to face Clara. The thought of her made my blood boil, but I knew I needed to confront them both to reclaim my life and my dignity. In that moment, as I looked into the eyes of the man I once loved, I felt a flicker of hope. I was ready to take my power back. As I sat at the dining table, the sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm glow over the carefully set place. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of vanilla from the candles flickering in the background. I had invited Clara over, ostensibly to mend fences, to find some semblance of peace after everything that had unraveled. My heart raced, but I steeled myself, knowing that this meeting was pivotal. When the doorbell rang, my stomach twisted into knots. I took a deep breath, smoothing my hair back and adjusting my blouse before opening the door. Clara stood there, her smile bright and inviting, completely unaware of the storm brewing beneath my composed exterior. I welcomed her inside, forcing a smile that felt more like a mask than a genuine expression. We exchanged pleasantries, the small talk feeling like a brittle facade over the churning emotions beneath. As we settled into our seats, the atmosphere shifted. Clara's laughter echoed lightly, but I could hardly hear it over the pounding of my heart. I poured us both coffee, the rich liquid swirling in the cups, mirroring the tumult of thoughts swirling in my mind. I had rehearsed this moment countless times, yet the words felt heavy on my tongue, tangled in a web of hurt and betrayal. With a deep breath, I broke the silence, letting the words spill out. I told Clara about the betrayal, the visceral pain of walking in on her and Henry, the shock that had rooted me to the spot as I watched the two of them entwined in a moment that should have been sacred. My voice trembled slightly, but I forced myself to speak. I needed her to understand the depth of the wound she had inflicted, the ripple effect of her actions that had shattered my world. As I spoke, I noticed Clara's expression shift. Initially confident, her facade began to crack as realization washed over her. I could see the flicker of vulnerability in her eyes, the way her breath hitched just slightly. It was a moment of power for me, watching her unravel as she absorbed the weight of my words. I had thought she would be defensive, perhaps even dismissive, but there was a shift, an acknowledgement of the pain I was laying bare before her. I pressed on, sharing the feelings of betrayal, the confusion that had settled in my heart. I explained how I had trusted her, how I had considered her a friend. Each word felt like a release, a catharsis that drained some of the poison from my heart. Clara's shoulders sagged, and I could see her grappling with the consequences of her choices, the consequences she had never anticipated. The conversation took on an electric charge, filling the room with an intensity that felt almost palpable. I had entered this meeting wanting reconciliation, wanting to find a way to coexist in our shared space, but as I laid my heart open, I realized that I was seeking something far more significant: my own empowerment. Clara's reactions, her shifting expressions, were like a mirror reflecting the strength I had been cultivating within myself. Without warning, I heard the soft creak of the floorboards behind me, a sound that sent a jolt through my body. Henry, lurking nearby, had been eavesdropping. I felt a rush of indignation and vulnerability as I turned slightly to see him standing at the entrance, his expression one of shock and perhaps guilt. I had hoped to confront him in a moment of my own choosing, but here he was, caught in the crossfire of my confrontation with Clara. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and charged. My heart raced as I continued to hold my gaze on Clara, refusing to let the presence of my husband derail the momentum I had built. I was not only confronting Clara, I was reclaiming my narrative, taking back the power that had been stripped from me. I could sense the gravity of the moment pressing down on all of us, and I refused to let it break me. Clara looked from me to Henry and back again, her expression shifting from defiance to a flicker of fear. I could see that she was realizing the depth of the situation, the way it was escalating beyond her control. I felt a strange sense of exhilaration coursing through me. This was my moment. I was not merely a victim in this story. I was a force, ready to face whatever came next. As I continued to speak, pouring out my heart, I felt the chains of my past begin to loosen. I was no longer the woman who had walked into that bedroom, naive and trusting. I was Mary, standing tall, ready to confront the consequences of betrayal and reclaim my story. As I sat across from Clara, the air between us crackled with tension. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, but I was no longer the timid wife who had once been paralyzed by her presence. I had found my voice, and I intended to use it. Clara, once so confident and poised, began to unravel before me, her facade cracking under the weight of my honesty. I watched as she shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her bravado dissipating like mist in the morning sun. She started to speak, her words tumbling out in a desperate attempt to justify her actions. I could see the guilt swirling in her eyes, the recognition of her betrayal manifesting in her trembling hands. As she confessed to her part in the affair, her voice faltered, and for the first time I sensed a flicker of vulnerability. It was a stark contrast to the self-assured woman I had always perceived her to be. Yet, even as she offered her apologies, I felt my anger surge. Each justification she made felt like a dagger, twisting deeper into the wound of betrayal that had been inflicted upon me. My heart raced, not just from anger but from an overwhelming sense of empowerment. I was no longer the passive observer in my own life, I was reclaiming my narrative. I needed her to understand the full extent of her actions, the gravity of the pain she had caused not just to me, but to my marriage. I held her gaze, refusing to back down or allow her to evade the consequences of her choices. In that moment, I became acutely aware of the power dynamics between us, the way she had briefly held dominion over my emotions, and how I was now the one standing tall, resolute in my truth. Henry's voice broke through the tension like a thunderclap, attempting to intervene. I could feel his desperation, his need to mediate, but I refused to allow him to dilute the confrontation. He was as much a part of this betrayal as Clara was, and I would not let him escape the reckoning that was unfolding. I turned my focus back to Clara, determination hardening my resolve. I made it clear that the betrayal wove a web that ensnared all three of us, and I would not let him play the victim or the peacemaker. This was my moment, and I would not share it. Clara's expression shifted from anger to defeat as she realized I was unyielding. The bravado that had once defined her crumbled, and I saw the raw emotion beneath, a cocktail of shame and regret. She was cornered, and I reveled in the clarity that came with my newfound strength. It was a bittersweet victory. I was dismantling the lie we had all lived in, but it came at the cost of a friendship I had thought was real. In a final outburst, Clara stood abruptly, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. Her stormy exit left the air thick with unresolved emotions. I watched as she rushed out, the door slamming behind her, echoing like a final nail driven into the coffin of our shared history. With Clara gone, the room felt eerily quiet, as if it were holding its breath. I turned to Henry, and the weight of our shared silence crashed down on us. There was no more pretense, no more distractions. The wreckage of our relationship lay bare before us, and I felt a mix of triumph and sorrow wash over me. I had confronted the two people who had betrayed me, but the aftermath left me grappling with the reality of what lay ahead. In that moment of stillness, I understood that the journey I was about to undertake was not just about confronting betrayal, it was about rediscovering who I was outside of this marriage. I felt a flicker of hope, a tiny flame igniting within me, signaling the start of my transformation. I had faced my demons head-on, and while the path ahead seemed daunting, I knew I was ready to walk it. I was no longer defined by the betrayal I had endured. I was reclaiming my story, and I would emerge stronger than ever. As I stood there, the weight of my decision pressed down on me like a heavy shroud. I had finally taken the plunge, filing for divorce. The papers had been signed and submitted, marking the end of a chapter steeped in betrayal and deceit. The act itself felt liberating, yet the reality of what I was leaving behind loomed large. I could almost hear the echoes of our past reverberating in the empty spaces of the house we had built together, taunting me with memories of laughter and love that now felt so distant. I had given so much of myself to this relationship, and yet here I was, standing at the precipice of a new beginning, armed with the painful lessons learned from heartbreak. But it was during this time of reckoning that I stumbled upon a revelation that would change everything. Clara, the woman who had wormed her way into my life, was not merely a seductress, she was a manipulator. As I pieced together fragments of conversations and memories, it became clear that she had been harboring a deep-rooted jealousy towards me. Clara, with her charming smile and seemingly innocent demeanor, had played a wicked game. She had sought to undermine my marriage, whispering sweet nothings into Henry's ear while simultaneously planting seeds of doubt and insecurity. The betrayal wasn't just about infidelity, it was about the malicious intent that had fueled the fire of their affair. With this newfound knowledge, I felt a surge of empowerment. Clara's actions were not just a reflection of Henry's weakness, but of her own insecurities and bitterness. I would not allow myself to be painted as the victim in this narrative. The realization was a turning point. I was no longer the woman scorned but a warrior rising from the ashes of betrayal. As I prepared for the divorce hearing, the anticipation of standing before Henry and facing him with the truth filled me with a fierce determination. I could see the strength I had buried beneath layers of hurt and disappointment beginning to emerge. The day of the hearing arrived, and I stepped into the cold, sterile room filled with attorneys and legal jargon. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and I could feel my heart racing. Henry, sitting there with an air of desperation, looked up at me as if hoping for a glimmer of the love we once shared. His eyes were a mixture of regret and pleading, but I refused to let his remorse sway me. I had spent too long living in the shadow of his choices, too long allowing his mistakes to define my worth. When my turn came to speak, I felt the weight of my experiences coalesce into a powerful resolve. I looked straight into Henry's eyes, refusing to shy away from the truth. I laid bare the betrayal, not just of his infidelity but of the trust he had shattered. I spoke of the moments when I had felt inadequate, the whispers of Clara's manipulation that haunted me, and the silent battles I had fought within myself. Each word was a step toward reclaiming my power, a declaration that I would not be reduced to a victim of their choices. As I walked away from the hearing, I felt lighter, as if a burden had been lifted from my shoulders. I had faced the man who had betrayed me, and in doing so, I had confronted the darkest parts of myself. I was no longer defined by my marriage, nor by the betrayal that had shaken my world. I was Mary, a woman who had endured and emerged stronger. I was ready to embrace a future unshackled from the chains of the past. Stepping out into the sunlight, I took a deep breath, feeling the warmth on my skin. The air was fresh and invigorating, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of hope blossom within me. I had learned the importance of self-love and resilience, and as I took my first steps toward a new beginning, I knew I was on the path to reclaiming my life. This was not just an end, it was the beginning of something beautiful. I was ready to embrace whatever came next, confident in the knowledge that I had the strength to face it all.